This is not a story about glory. It's about the lives that were saved and the truth that was buried. Subscribe to the story Beyond the Impact, like this video, and stay until the end to uncover the secret rescue on Everest the world was never meant to hear about. The storm had come in fast, too fast for any forecast. Base camp was chaos, radios screamed, oxygen tanks ran empty, and climbers vanished into white oblivion. Somewhere above 8,000 meters, known as the death zone, a group of 7 climbers had been presumed lost. Their GPS beacons stopped transmitting. No voice contact, no emergency flares. The official announcement came at dawn. Search suspended, no viable recovery. But what the world never knew was that someone went after them anyway. Carlos Mendez remembers that night vividly. A former Air Force pilot from Chile, now working in Nepal as a flight engineer for a private expedition company, Carlos received a call on a restricted channel, one he hadn't used in over a decade. The voice was curt, coded, familiar. Mendez, Mission Protocol 17 to C, rendezvous, Hangar Kilo 60400, no logs. That meant one thing, a ghost operation, no records, no oversight, no medals. By 4 a.m. he was fueling up an unmarked Eurocopter AS-350. It bore no flag, no serial number, just a scratch in the paint where an old military insignia had once been. 3 others joined him. None spoke. One was a medic. One carried a case with a satellite uplink. The last wore climbing gear. Mendez flew blind into the storm. They reached Camp 4 in 22 minutes. From there, instruments went dead, altimeter frozen, GPS scrambled. Only instinct remained. Then, like ghosts in the snow, they found them. 5 of the 7 climbers, barely conscious, frostbitten, collapsed in the crevasse shadows. 2 were already gone. They loaded the survivors. No names were exchanged, no photos. Just the haunting groans of wind and a promise that none of this had happened. Back at base camp, no one asked where the helicopter came from. It landed behind a makeshift barrier, shielded from satellite view. The survivors were rushed into medical tents under fake IDs. Not a single fingerprint was taken. Carlos watched as a foreign official, possibly American, though no badge was shown, handed a sealed envelope to the expedition coordinator. Your climbers were never missing. There was no emergency. If anyone asks, they were rescued at Camp 2, not the death zone. Understood? The coordinator nodded. Coordinator. In the records, the 5 survivors were listed as mild altitude sickness, assisted descent. But one of them, a woman in her late 30s, slipped Carlos a torn corner of her map as she was wheeled away. On it, scribbled in pen, "We weren't alone. There was something else up there." Mendez pocketed the note, never speaking of it, until now. 15 years later, that same woman, Dr. Ellie Chan, was found dead in a Tokyo hotel room. Cause, suicide. Next to her body, a single envelope with a name, Carlos Mendez. Inside, a flash drive and the same torn map corner. The flash drive contained audio logs. One of them, dated 2 days before her death, said, "They said we'd forget. They promised the memory would fade. But I still see it, the light in the snow that didn't belong. We weren't supposed to survive. We disrupted something." Carlos pressed play again. The file was corrupted, static. Then, a voice, distorted, male. "Phase incomplete. 1 unit extracted. Terminate recall cycle." Was this a military operation, a psychological experiment, or something far stranger? Carlos finally broke his silence, and that's how this story came to us. What do you think the climbers really saw above 8,000 meters? Comment below. Something else was up there, if you believe this rescue was never meant to be revealed. And don't forget to subscribe to the story Beyond the Impact. We're just getting started. Her name was Nina Rostov. A 29-year-old climber from Russia, she was among the 5 rescued during the unlogged extraction. In the official records, she was treated for hypothermia and released. But what no one ever mentioned was that she didn't speak a single word for 18 months, after being brought down from the death zone. Her family had filed a missing persons report 3 days before the storm hit. When she reappeared, they were told her GPS had malfunctioned and she'd been recovered early with minor injuries. But her medical records were sealed. Her climbing team disbanded within a week. Nina herself vanished into rural Siberia. No interviews, no public statements, silence, until now. Julian Harrow, a British documentarian, found her by accident while researching isolated disappearances near Irkutsk. He was filming a short segment on recluses living in post-Soviet ghost towns when an old woman pointed him to the one who climbs but never speaks. He found Nina living alone in a cabin, surrounded by notebooks, hundreds of them, all written in tiny, obsessive handwriting, all repeating phrases like, "It wasn't a storm, it was a shield. We were told to close our eyes. I didn't. Don't follow the light that doesn't cast shadows." Julian convinced her to speak, on camera, for the first time. Her voice was raspy, deliberate. "I remember waking up alone, above the ice ridge. I thought I had died. Then I saw them, 3 figures, human shapes, but wrong. Their suits shimmered, but not from the snow. They didn't breathe, they didn't blink. They moved like smoke." She said they didn't speak, but somehow she understood them. They weren't there to help, they were there to collect. When Julian pressed for details, she grew pale and whispered, "One of them looked like my brother, but he died 10 years ago." She stood, went to a drawer, and handed him a sealed envelope. Inside, a patch, the exact insignia that had once been scratched off the helicopter Mendez flew. Julian took it to a military contact. The patch didn't match any active unit, but it did match a disbanded research group affiliated with a Cold War-era project called Siberia Echo, a project known for one thing: testing human perception at high altitudes. The deeper you go, the colder it gets. Not just in temperature, but in truth. Julian, with Nina's permission, sent one of her notebooks to a linguistics expert at Oxford. The analyst, Dr. Adrian Levant, confirmed something chilling. Several pages were written in Mirror English, a reverse-coded format often used in deep psychological conditioning. One sentence stood out: "Subject alpha failed to integrate. Isolation triggered recursion. Recommend containment." Julian contacted Carlos Mendez again, asking if he recognized the phrase. Carlos didn't answer immediately. Hours later, he sent a message: "Frostline wasn't just a rescue, it was a test. We were part of it too." He finally agreed to an off-the-record meeting in Santiago. Julian flew down with a hidden recorder. Carlos brought out a metal case. Inside, photos, dispatches, and a black-bound folder labeled Operation Frostline, Classified. He opened it and began reading aloud. Objective: deploy simulated rescue protocol in high-altitude hostile environment. Measure response to non-linear stressors. Monitor exposure to anomalous stimuli. Enforce memory suppression upon completion. Julian interrupted. "Wait, are you saying the rescue wasn't real?" Carlos shook his head. "No, it was real, but the storm wasn't natural. The mission wasn't to save them, it was to watch them. And us." Inside the folder were photos of the climbers, taken before the ascent. But one photo stunned Julian. There was a 6th face he didn't recognize. Not one of the climbers, not Carlos, not his crew. A man with deep-set eyes, pale skin, and no reflection in the window behind him. Written underneath, "Observer Unit 3, not to be engaged." Carlos had never seen him before. Julian, however, had. On Everest, in his own footage, a blurry figure in the background. He hadn't noticed it until now. Julian sat in a dim hotel room in Santiago, reviewing the footage again. The figure in the background, the so-called Observer Unit 3, was unmistakable now. In one shot, he stood motionless near Camp 3, in a spot no one recalled seeing him. In another, he was at the ridgeline, but his shape distorted slightly, like the camera lens refused to capture him fully. Carlos, visibly shaken, admitted something else. That wasn't the first time I saw him. He recalled a night during his military training over the Andes, years before the Everest mission. An altitude test had gone wrong. One soldier panicked mid-flight. When Carlos turned around to calm him, he saw the same pale figure sitting calmly in the back of the cargo hold, despite no record of anyone boarding there. I never spoke of it. I was told altitude can mess with your head. I wanted to believe that. Julian reached out to Dr. Adrian Levant again. He ran facial recognition scans on the image. The result? No match in any civilian, military, or intelligence database across 14 countries. But it got stranger. Adrian used a behavioral analysis algorithm designed to detect human versus synthetic movement. The scan concluded with 91% certainty. Subject does not exhibit standard biological micro-expressions. Julian dug deeper. Through a contact in Berlin, he uncovered declassified scraps of a project called Oracle Ice. The files were fragmented but consistent. Subject 3, embedded in high-altitude events, non-verbal, goal, data acquisition, appears during anomalous meteorological activity, interference with standard perception noted. The timeline matched Nina's recovery and Carlos's flight. If this observer wasn't human or wasn't fully human, then what was he watching for? And more importantly, why did he only appear in environments like Everest? Julian theorized something wild. What if Everest isn't just the highest point on Earth, but also the weakest point between dimensions? 3 weeks later, Julian hiked to a private base near the Khumbu Glacier, determined to retrace the path of the 2008 expedition. He hired 2 Sherpa guides, both of whom were hesitant about the mission. One, Tenzing Norbu, finally confessed, "There is a place above Camp 3 that we do not go, not because of danger, because of memory." Julian asked what he meant. Tenzing pointed to his temple. "They call it the Forgetting Ridge. If you climb too far, your brain turns off. You come back without the climb." Julian thought it superstition. Until they reached Camp 3. The camp was deserted, as expected, but Julian noticed something disturbing. His equipment, specifically his satellite tracker, stopped working. Compass readings spun in circles. GPS said they were standing in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Then they saw it. A single tent standing alone, not part of any known expedition. Tenzing refused to approach. Julian, however, did. Inside the tent, nothing made sense. There were sealed water bottles with labels in multiple languages, including Cyrillic, Mandarin, and what appeared to be Arabic dialects, used only in state-level communications. There was a sealed folder marked Cycle 17, Reset Denied. And inside, a photograph of the same climbers from 2008. All 7, alive, standing together, smiling. The background was unmistakable, the death zone, but according to all records, 2 of them died during that storm. Julian ran outside, yelling to Tenzing to see it, but Tenzing was gone. Only footprints in the snow, leading up the ridge and then vanishing. Julian's satellite phone flickered back to life just long enough to receive a message. Unknown. Sender. You are not authorized to recall. Turn back. He tried to respond. The signal died. That night, Julian sat alone in the tent. Outside, the wind howled, but through the static of his old emergency radio, a voice whispered, "This is Unit 3. Observation confirmed. Subject unstable. Memory breach probable." The voice sounded like Carlos, except Carlos was back in Santiago, or was he? Julian descended to base camp in a daze. The photograph he'd found in the tent, 7 climbers alive, including the 2 officially declared dead, was now buried deep inside his backpack, wrapped in layers of insulation. As if protecting it meant preserving whatever sliver of truth remained untouched, but something else haunted him. His memory of the solo night in the tent felt fragmented. He could recall whispering voices, cold breath on the back of his neck, and the feeling that someone had been inside his mind, rearranging thoughts like furniture. Back in Kathmandu, he visited an old contact, Dr. Malika Rezwan, a neurologist and cognitive researcher who had previously worked with veterans experiencing dissociative memory lapses after high-altitude trauma. He asked her to run a full cognitive scan. The results were inconclusive, but alarming. Julian's hippocampal activity showed irregularities consistent with deep memory interruption, a condition observed in test subjects who had undergone extreme isolation and experimental psychological conditioning. Then Malika said something that chilled him. "You have memory clusters that don't match your timeline. Either you're remembering someone else's experiences or your own memories have been replaced." Julian handed her the photo. Her face changed. "I've seen him before," she whispered, pointing at one of the two dead climbers. "He came to one of our clinics in 2011. Said his name was Felix Moreau, French accent, disoriented, no passport. We tried to report it, but someone from the embassy took him, told us not to file the visit, said it was classified repatriation." Julian nearly dropped the photograph. Felix Moreau was officially pronounced dead on May 14, 2008, on Everest. Cause of death, exposure. But Dr. Rizwan's record showed he was alive 3 years later, showing signs of psychological reprogramming. Julian now had a new goal: find Felix. Geneva, Switzerland. Known for diplomacy, banking, and secrets polished in glass towers. Julian traced Felix's last known movement to a facility just outside the city, one connected to a joint research effort between the UN's Department of Humanitarian Technology and an NGO with suspicious ties, IceWatch. On the surface, IceWatch was a weather monitoring initiative, but buried within their financials were oddities, grants issued under vague terms like perceptual cycle integrity and observation reintegration programs. He posed as a documentary researcher, requesting access to weather archive footage from the Himalayas. The receptionist froze when Julian mentioned Everest 2008. She made a call. Minutes later, a man in a grey suit approached. "Mr. Harrow, I'm afraid we cannot provide that footage. Those records have been reclassified." "Why?" Julian asked. "For the same reason you're still alive. Turn around. Forget the summit." Before Julian could respond, another voice emerged behind him. "Let him speak." It was Felix Moreau. Older, gaunt, but unmistakable. Later, in a hidden cafe near the Rhône, Felix explained everything in hushed tones. "I remember waking up in a white room, tubes in my arms, lights that never went off, and men, no, things, standing over me asking questions without words. I remember walking through snow that never crunched. I remember voices inside my dreams, pulling my thoughts apart." Julian asked if Felix had seen Observer Unit 3. Felix nodded slowly. "He followed me, not just up the mountain, through the dream states. He wasn't watching the mountain. He was watching what Everest does to the mind." Felix opened a small case. Inside was an injection vial labeled Cycle Suppressant, Echo 13. "They keep us docile. These injections erase the instability, make us forget. But I stopped taking them. That's why I remember." Felix pulled out a second photo. It was nearly identical to the one Julian had found in the tent, same 7 climbers. Except this time, Observer Unit 3 was in the picture too, standing right behind Julian. Julian had no memory of this photograph ever being taken, which meant someone else did. After leaving Geneva, Julian boarded a train to Berlin, but even in the quiet of his cabin, something didn't feel right. He began noticing small changes in his own behavior, using words he didn't normally say, recalling events he hadn't lived. He felt like his identity was slipping between versions. He pulled out the 2 photographs, the Everest team with 7 climbers, one with Observer Unit 3, one without. He flipped them back and forth, side by side. And then he noticed something. In one of them, his shadow was cast east. In the other, west, same mountain, same pose, but opposing light sources. The sun couldn't have moved that drastically in a split second, unless they were taken on different versions of the mountain, different realities. He arrived in Berlin and met with a former intelligence analyst named Tobias Grimm, who specialized in temporal overlap theories, the kind of fringe science dismissed by most governments, but quietly funded under black ops programs. Julian laid out everything: the helicopter rescue, Nina, Carlos, the tent, Felix, the reclassified missions, and the photographs. Tobias wasn't surprised. We've long suspected Everest is one of several perception points, places on Earth where memory, identity, and physics become unstable. They're not naturally occurring. They're engineered. Julian leaned forward. Engineered by who? Tobias opened a drawer and revealed a file labeled Avalanche Protocol, Site 4B. Inside were documents referencing high-altitude exposure trials, experiments with memory suppression, and a mysterious group referred to only as the Council of Echoes. They monitor trauma response to extreme environments. But more than that, they test how reality itself can be rewritten in someone's mind. One of the documents mentioned a subject with high cognitive resistance, someone who remembered fragments even after full protocol. Subject name, Julian Harrow. Julian's stomach dropped. He never consented to be part of any trial, but maybe he already had, and maybe that consent had been erased. Tobias gave Julian one final lead. A cache of files stored deep in the Swiss Alps, allegedly placed by a defector from the Council of Echoes. The route would take Julian across dangerous terrain. He went alone. 3 days into the journey, as he neared the designated coordinates, a storm rolled in, just like the one Carlos had described. The air changed. The soundscape changed. Snowflakes seemed to fall slower. He found a half-buried box beneath a marked cairn. Inside, an encrypted flash drive, a cassette tape, a blood-stained glove. He played the tape on a wind-up recorder. If you're hearing this, you've survived the first layer, but what you remember is not the test. You are. We never meant to leave you in the cycle, but your resistance was enlightening. They will come for you now, unless you return to the summit and shut the gate yourself. Julian couldn't breathe. There was no map, no guide, just the phrase, "Shut the gate." He radioed Tobias, but only static returned. Then, from behind a ridge, he heard it. A deep, resonant hum, mechanical, ancient, almost musical. It wasn't coming from above, it was coming from within the mountain. A low voice followed. Subject 7 has broken threshold containment. Julian turned, and there he was. Observer Unit 3, closer than ever. But this time, Julian didn't run. He stepped forward. "What am I?" The observer tilted its head, not out of confusion, but calculation. "You are not the story. You are the rewrite." The snow exploded in silence, and Julian remembered everything. Julian awoke in a room with no windows, white walls pulsing with faint light. A soft hum filled the air, synchronized with his heartbeat. He wasn't restrained, but every movement felt monitored. A voice came through an unseen speaker. "You crossed the threshold. The cycle was meant to erase you. You rewrote it." He tried to respond, but his throat was dry, parched with something more than thirst. A loss of time. In the corner of the room sat a table. On it, 7 photographs, all versions of himself, each in different gear, different expressions, different eyes. "These are your iterations, not reincarnations. Recursions." The voice continued. "Your mind was selected not for what you remember, but for what you refuse to forget." Suddenly, flashes. Carlos screaming through static, Nina's notebooks, burning, Felix injecting the suppressant, Observer Unit 3, standing beside Julian's mother in a childhood memory that had never happened before. Julian fell to his knees. "What did you do to me?" A new voice emerged, this time female, calm and terrifyingly familiar. "You volunteered." The room shifted. The walls shimmered. Behind a pane of transparent shielding she appeared, Dr. Solène Kiefer, one of the original neuroscientists behind Operation Frostline. She should have been retired, or dead. The summit wasn't the test, she said. You were, and we lost control of you when you remembered. Julian's hands began to tremble. You made me climb the mountain. No, you've never been to Everest, she replied. We simulated it. Layered trauma, induced by controlled environments. Everest was your anchor, your brain's way of rationalizing the cycle. He couldn't breathe. So, the others? Some were real, some were implanted. That's the beauty of perception. Memory isn't history, it's narrative. Then she said the most horrifying part. You're still inside the gate. Julian stared at his own reflection, but something was wrong. His reflection blinked, out of sync. He touched the glass. It pushed back. Suddenly, he remembered. He had stood in this room before, dozens of times, maybe hundreds. Each time he had chosen to forget, and each time he had been reset. You are Observer Unit 3. The words came from behind him. Felix stood in the doorway, no longer pale, no longer trembling. He wore a lab coat, eyes filled with cold clarity. You're not being monitored. You are monitoring yourself. Every cycle ends with the same question. Will you accept the lie or open the gate? Julian shook his head violently. I never consented. You did. Under Project Recurve, signed in 2005. You were the first volunteer. I don't remember that. Of course not. That's the point. Felix stepped forward and handed him a final object, a keycard labeled Gate Exit Protocol, 1 use. You can leave this time, but only if you close the loop. Julian hesitated. Was this freedom, or just another layer? He swiped the card. The room flickered, the glass cracked, voices screamed from the walls. Then, silence. He was back on Everest. Real? Simulated? It didn't matter. He walked through the snow until he found the summit, alone. A plaque stood where no plaque had ever been. Here stood the mind of a man who remembered too much. And underneath it, his name, Julian Harrow. He smiled. For the first time, not because it was written, but because he chose to. Behind him, the mountain groaned. But this time, it was quiet. Julian stood at what he believed to be the summit of Everest, yet there was no wind, no freezing bite to the air, no oxygen deprivation. The snow beneath his boots didn't melt or crunch. The silence felt artificial. He dropped to his knees and dug into the snow. It was only a few inches deep. Beneath it, a reflective surface, smooth, curved, not ice, not stone, glass. Julian stared into it, and it stared back. But the reflection wasn't his. It was Observer Unit 3, copying his movements, milliseconds out of sync. I never left, Julian whispered. The mountain groaned again. Cracks formed in the sky like stress fractures in porcelain. He was still inside. And then, a voice he hadn't heard in what felt like lifetimes. Nina Rostov. Julian, they don't want you to know what the summit is. He spun around. There she stood, older, exhausted, but real. What is this place? A looped construct. They call it the Mirror Mountain. It was never meant to simulate Everest. It was meant to simulate you, me, your mind, your thresholds, your breaking point. They built it around you. Julian collapsed. His memories flooded in. Hundreds of iterations, moments that had seemed like dreams but were carefully placed memory tiles meant to construct obedience, erase rebellion. You were the first one who climbed out. Every other version chose comfort. To forget. Why did you stay behind? Julian asked. To wait for the version of you strong enough to remember. She handed him a notebook. Hers, pages filled with hand-drawn diagrams of the loop's architecture. There's a way out, but it requires one final descent. Julian laughed bitterly. Down? Not up? Yes, she nodded, because the truth was never at the top. They turned. The glass mountain shimmered, starting to fragment. And behind them, a descending staircase of light, winding downward into the void. Julian took a breath, reached for Nina's hand. They stepped into the descent. The staircase was cold and made of something that wasn't stone, but remembered stone. Every step down echoed with a whisper, as if the stairs were carved from old thoughts. The walls pulsed with light. Memories flickered across their surfaces like film reels. Julian's mother reading a book that ended differently each time. Carlos staring into a static-filled cockpit, muttering, "Not again." Felix injecting the suppressant into someone else, into Julian. Observer Unit 3 standing at the bottom of a hospital bed, watching Julian sleep. "What is this?" Julian asked. Nina replied quietly, "This is the origin layer before Everest, before Frostline. This is where they first accessed you." Julian stopped walking. He saw a door at the bottom, red, massive, labeled Gate A0, Observer Birth Point. "I was created here," he said, the words spilling from his mouth before he'd fully thought them. Nina nodded. "You weren't their first observer, but you were the first to resist recursion. That made you dangerous." The door opened on its own. Inside was a white chamber, identical to the one he'd awoken in after escaping Geneva. A console blinked slowly. On it, 2 options: shut down Mirror Mountain, merge with Observer Unit 3. Julian turned to Nina. "What happens if I merge? You lose yourself, but the loop ends for everyone else. All other cycles collapse, real memories return. And if I shut it down? The system reboots, starts again, cleaner, smarter." Julian hesitated. He stepped toward the console. "Merge." He pressed it. The chamber filled with blinding light, screams, static, snow, voices overlapping in dozens of languages. Nina vanished. His body collapsed, and something else stood in its place. Not Julian, not Observer Unit 3, but both. It looked into the mirrored walls of the chamber, and then it spoke. "I remember everything, and now I choose what to forget." The loop shuddered. Everest collapsed inward, and in the silence that followed, reality reset. There was no sky above, no ground below, only echoes. And then, breath. Julian opened his eyes. Or, the version of him that had merged with Observer Unit 3 did. He stood in a park. Children played. Birds chirped. But it was all too perfect. The kind of perfection that reveals itself to be artificial when you stare too long. A man sat on a bench nearby, reading a newspaper that shifted languages mid-headline. He smiled at Julian. "Cycle complete," he said casually. Julian turned to the glassy surface of a water fountain. His reflection rippled, now his own face, now the observer's. Something new, something in between. He was no longer being watched. He was the one watching. "Where are the others?" Julian asked. The man folded his paper. "Freed. Their minds are being restored piece by piece. Memories are rewriting themselves. Those who were never on Everest will forget Everest. Those who climbed will remember the real summit." Julian sat beside him. "And Nina?" The man paused. "She stayed behind to guide the next one. Next one. There's always another." The wind rustled the trees, but there were no roots. This was a construct, the staging area after the collapse of the loop. Julian felt the weight of all his iterations, all his failures, all the versions that had chosen to forget. And yet, here he was, the final branch that chose to remember. The man stood and offered Julian a folder. On it, Storyline 001, Seed Observer. "The truth has a cost. You paid it." Julian opened the folder. Inside, a blank page, followed by another, and another. Only on the last one, scrawled in his own handwriting, "This story doesn't end. It just finds new storytellers." He looked up. The man was gone. The world began to deconstruct, pixel by pixel, frame by frame. He stood alone at the center of collapsing memory. And he did the only thing he could. He spoke the story aloud, every name, every place, every broken piece of truth. He told it to no one, but also to everyone, because that's how memory survives, through stories, through you, and in a place far from simulation, far from Everest, far from control. Someone wakes up and whispers, "I remember the mountain." If you were changed by this story, if it felt too real, comment, "I was there," and subscribe to the story Beyond the Impact for the next truth they don't want you to remember.